Commander Sarah Vance checked her rifle one final time before the helicopters touched down. The Outpost 4 landing zone was narrow, a clearing carved out of pine and rocky terrain, sitting maybe 3,000 feet above sea level in a region that officially didn't exist on any military map. Unofficially, it mattered more than most places on Earth. The rotors kicked up dust as her 12-person team dispersed across the LZ. They'd been briefed on the objective: secure the communications facility, photograph the encrypted servers, and extract within 40 minutes. In and out. Clean. Sarah had run operations like this before. She'd commanded 72 missions without losing a single soldier under her watch. That streak was about to end in ways she couldn't imagine. "Perimeter secure," came the voice of her second-in-command, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, through the headset. His tone was calm, professional. He'd trained under her for 3 years. He trusted her completely. Sarah nodded, though he couldn't see her. She moved toward the concrete bunker entrance, her tactical vest heavy with ammunition, her mind already 2 steps ahead, running through extraction routes, calculating fallback positions, considering what could go wrong. The forest around them was dense and dark. Birds had stopped singing 10 minutes ago. That detail nagged at her, though she pushed it aside. Instinct was important, but overthinking killed more soldiers than complacency. The facility was smaller than expected. 3 rooms, 2 servers, and a filing cabinet that turned out to contain paper records, names, dates, transaction amounts. Sarah photographed everything while Webb and his team secured the perimeter. The names on those documents looked like military brass. Some were unfamiliar. One name appeared dozens of times across nearly every page: General Arthur Sterling. He was the supreme commander of her entire operational region. He was the person she reported to. He was also, apparently, involved in something that required encrypted servers hidden inside a mountain and armed guards who'd been paid extremely well to keep their mouths shut. 7 minutes, Webb said through the headset. Sarah photographed the last page and photographed it again to be sure. Something cold had settled in her chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. She was holding evidence of something massive, the kind of something that didn't end well for the people who discovered it. She radioed for extraction. "Eagle 1 to base. We're ready for pickup. Standing by." Static answered her back. Then nothing. "Eagle 1 to base. Confirm reception." More static. Sarah's jaw tightened. "Webb, we may have a comms issue. Check the repeater." That's when the mortars came in. The first impact hit the north edge of the clearing, roughly 200 meters from their position. The explosion threw dirt into the air and kicked up a wall of sound that made her teeth ache. Sarah was already moving, already shouting orders, already knowing with absolute certainty that this wasn't an accident. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had coordinates. "Contact! North and east! Move to the bunker!" she screamed into her headset. The team scattered toward the building. Gunfire ripped through the clearing from multiple positions. Automatic weapons, sustained fire, professional fire. This wasn't a militia. This wasn't local fighters. This was organized military assault, and it was coming from at least 4 different positions around the perimeter. Webb was running toward her, already bleeding from a graze wound across his shoulder, shouting something she couldn't hear over the noise. She grabbed him and pulled him toward the bunker entrance. 3 of her soldiers were already inside, setting up a defensive position in the main room. Outside, the mortars kept coming. Not rapid fire, but methodical. Deliberate. Designed to flush them out rather than bury them. "Return fire," Sarah commanded. "Small arms only. Make them pay for every meter." But even as she said it, she knew they were finished. Real extraction wasn't coming. The helicopters that had dropped them off were probably already 100 kilometers away, redirected by someone higher up the chain. Someone who didn't want this team coming home. 4 minutes passed, maybe 5. Time compressed and expanded in ways that made seconds feel like hours. Sarah returned fire from the window, dropping at least 2 attackers on the eastern flank. Her soldiers fought hard, fought like they had something to survive for. They didn't. Not anymore. The explosives came next, professional demolition charges placed directly against the reinforced walls. The structure shook, and dust fell from the ceiling like snow. Sarah realized they weren't trying to kill them quickly. They were systematically destroying the facility, collapsing the structure to bury the evidence. "We need to move, now!" She grabbed Webb's arm and pulled him deeper into the bunker, toward a maintenance tunnel she'd noted during their initial sweep. Behind them, the eastern wall collapsed inward. Dust rolled through the corridors like a living thing. 7 soldiers made it into the tunnel with her. The others, 5 of them, stayed behind to slow down the assault team, buying time with their lives. The tunnel sloped downward, toward what looked like an old ventilation system. Sarah kept moving, kept running, kept her hand on Webb's back as he stumbled from blood loss. Behind them, they could hear shouting, could hear boots on concrete, could hear the systematic hunt for survivors. The ventilation shaft had a rusted grate covering the exit. Sarah tore it open with her hands, cutting her palms on the edges, and helped Webb through first. The late afternoon sun blinded her momentarily as she pulled herself out onto a steep hillside overlooking a vast forest that descended into mist and shadow. Webb was barely conscious. "Go," he wheezed. "Get the evidence out. That's the mission." Sarah picked him up. He was smaller than her, maybe 165 pounds, and started down the hillside, moving parallel to the tree line. Bullets kicked up dirt behind her. She didn't look back. Looking back was the death of soldiers. The forest swallowed them as the sun fell lower, turning the sky orange and purple. Sarah kept moving deeper, kept moving until the sounds of pursuit faded to nothing, kept moving until darkness became complete. Webb was unconscious in her arms, bleeding through the makeshift pressure dressing she'd applied with strips of fabric torn from his own uniform. She found a clearing near a small stream as the first stars appeared. She laid Webb down carefully and checked his wounds by the thin light of her watch. The graze across his shoulder was bad. The mortar shrapnel embedded in his lower abdomen was worse. Much worse. "Hold on," she whispered. "Just hold on." But even as she said it, she knew he wouldn't. Knew that out here, with no medical facility, no blood transfusion, no way to stop the internal bleeding, Webb was already gone. It would just take a few hours for his body to catch up with what had already happened. Sarah sat beside him and watched the darkness close in. Her evidence was intact, the photographs still stored in her tactical vest. 12 soldiers were dead. Her entire command had been obliterated, and the person responsible was sitting in a climate-controlled office somewhere, probably answering questions about why the Outpost 4 facility had experienced a catastrophic structural failure with all hands lost. The crimson woods stretched out around her in the darkness, ancient and indifferent. Sarah Vance was officially dead as far as the military was concerned. But something else was being born in that moment. Something harder, something patient, something that understood how to survive in the spaces between civilization and the wild. Something that wouldn't rest until General Arthur Sterling paid for every soldier she'd lost. She had nowhere to go but deeper into the forest, and she had all the time in the world to prepare. 3 months into the Crimson Woods, Sarah Vance stopped looking like someone who could be recognized. The forest had done most of that work. Her face was weathered darker than it had ever been in any desert deployment, lined by wind and sun and the kind of exhaustion that settles into bone. Her hair, which she'd kept regulation short for 17 years, had grown out in an uneven tangle that she kept tied back with paracord. Scars marked her left shoulder and right forearm, not from the ambush, but from a fever that had nearly killed her in week 2, when Webb's infection had spread to her own wounds through the close contact of survival. She'd carved the infection out of her shoulder with a heated blade and kept moving. The locals in the scattered settlements on the western edge of the forest had helped her, though she'd never asked directly. They simply recognized what she was. Someone fleeing something bigger than herself, and they left supplies at certain points. A package of antibiotics wrapped in cloth near a particular rock formation. Dried meat and flour left in a hollow tree marked with 3 vertical scratches. Information, sometimes. Whispered warnings about military patrols moving through the northern passes. She'd learned to think like the forest thought. To understand the patterns of light and shadow, the way wind moved through the dense pine, the routes that animals took and why those routes were usually the safest paths. She'd built a shelter, not a camp, something that couldn't be found unless you knew exactly where to look, using fallen timber and natural rock formations as camouflage. She'd established supply caches. She'd mapped every ridge, every stream, every place where the terrain could be used as a weapon. And she'd started hurting people. The first patrol she'd targeted was almost accidental. 4 soldiers, lightly armed, moving through the forest on what looked like a routine sweep. They weren't expecting resistance. They weren't expecting anything at all. Sarah had watched them from a ridge above the trail, studied their patterns, and made a decision that changed everything. She could have let them pass. She could have stayed hidden, could have remained just a ghost haunting the forest. Instead, she'd sabotaged their transport vehicle, a Humvee left at the base of the trail, by cutting brake lines and removing the rotor from their communications radio. When they returned to the vehicle 4 hours later, they'd find it impossible to call for help and dangerous to operate. The message would be clear. Something here didn't want them. They'd radioed for a recovery team from a different location using a handheld unit. That team had been tracked by Sarah, who documented their route and their numbers and the weapons they carried. 3 soldiers. Good condition. Professional bearing. She hadn't engaged them. Engaging them would have been overkill. She simply needed them to know that the forest wasn't safe. The rumors started 2 weeks later. "Someone's out there," a young private named Rodriguez told his bunkmates at Forward Base Delta, the closest military installation to the Crimson Woods. Sarah knew this because she'd been monitoring that base for weeks, learning the shift changes, the patrol patterns, the places where soldiers stood guard and talked about things they shouldn't have been talking about. In the forest, killing people. "Nobody's killing anyone," Sergeant Chen had responded. "Equipment fails, patrols get lost." 3 patrols lost in 4 weeks, Rodriguez insisted. "And the equipment? That's not failure. That's someone deliberately—" "That's enough," Chen had cut him off. But she hadn't disagreed. Sarah could tell by the tension in her shoulders as she'd walked away. The Golden Eagle appeared 2 weeks after that. Sarah had carved it into a massive pine tree that stood roughly 200 meters from the main patrol route. A symbol large enough to be impossible to miss, but positioned high enough that no accidental hiker would see it. The design was clean and striking. An eagle in profile, wings spread, done with deliberate knife work that made it look almost official. Military. Intentional. The symbolism hadn't been random. Every branch, every curve had been carefully planned. The eagle was a reference to Operation Eagle Wing, the classified mission that Vance had led years ago, a mission that only certain people would recognize. A message for anyone who knew her background, her history, her reputation. The message was simple: "I'm still here." Word of the carving had spread through the military installations surrounding the forest within 48 hours. By the end of the week, soldiers were mentioning it in the chow hall, speculating in barracks, passing theories around like currency. Some said it was a prank. Some said it was insurgents marking territory. Some, the ones who'd actually looked at the craftsmanship, at the precision of the knife work, said it was a message from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. By the end of month 4, there were 17 confirmed Golden Eagle carvings throughout the forest and in a carefully selected radius around it. Each one placed in locations that corresponded to successful sabotages of military operations, successful disruptions of Sterling supply lines, successful missions that left no one dead, but left everyone unsettled. General Arthur Sterling had dismissed the reports at first. Sarah knew this because she'd intercepted radio communications, had listened to his voice crackling through the dark on frequencies her soldiers had taught her to monitor. He'd called it hysteria. He'd ordered patrols to stop looking for ghosts. He'd reassigned 3 officers who'd suggested investigating the incident seriously. But his dismissal was theater. Sarah could tell by the tension in his voice, by the way he'd begun moving between locations more frequently, by the way he'd requested additional security at his compound. Sterling was afraid. He was afraid because, on some level, he knew. Or at least he suspected. He knew that Commander Sarah Vance had been in that bunker. He knew that she could have died in the explosion. But he also knew that she was the kind of soldier who had a way of surviving things that should have killed her. Month 5 brought a shift in his strategy. Sterling had reorganized patrol patterns, increased base security, and begun what looked like a systematic search of the forest with trained units. Not reckless patrols that stumbled into ambushes, but organized military operations designed to flush out hidden targets. Sarah had responded by going deeper. She'd established a network of scouts, not soldiers, but locals who understood the forest and wanted Sterling's corruption exposed as much as she did. They'd been carefully recruited, carefully briefed, and equipped with simple communication devices that couldn't be easily traced. They reported patrol movements, supply deliveries, and officer rotations. They became her eyes and ears across a radius of nearly 30 kilometers. She'd also begun documenting everything. Every destroyed patrol route, every sabotaged supply convoy, every moment of confusion and fear she'd created was recorded in a journal written in her own hand, with dates and times and tactical notes. She didn't know yet what she'd do with this information. She only knew that Sterling had orchestrated the deaths of 12 soldiers under her command, had tried to bury her with them, and that documentary evidence of his crimes, the real crimes, not the sabotage, but the weapons trafficking, the inflated contracts, the war profiteering, was still in her possession. Someone, someday, would need to know the truth. Someone who could actually do something about it. That someone hadn't revealed themselves yet. But Sarah had learned patience. The forest had taught her that. Time wasn't her enemy. Time was her greatest weapon. Every day that passed was a day Sterling spent wondering if the next patrol would disappear into the woods and never return. Every carved golden eagle was a reminder that the woman he'd tried to erase was still alive, still working, still building toward something he couldn't control. In month 6, a new transmission came through the network. Not from the locals, from someone in Sterling's command structure, someone who was starting to ask questions. The message was encrypted, but simple. "I know you're out there. I need to talk." Sarah Vance read the message 3 times before deciding what to do next. She'd spent 6 months alone in the forest, building leverage, establishing control, creating circumstances that gave her options. Now those options were starting to materialize. She carved a new symbol on a tree marked only on her private map. A specific location, a specific time, a message that only one person would understand. Then she waited to see who would be brave enough to answer. Captain Marcus Webb's younger brother, Daniel, had been 9 years old when Sarah Vance attended the funeral. The base chaplain had given the official speech about sacrifice and honor. Sarah had stood in dress uniform, the weight of guilt pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing, and watched Daniel Webb ask his mother why the flag-folding ceremony couldn't bring Marcus back. She'd never forgotten his face. 7 months after the ambush, Daniel Webb, now a junior intelligence analyst working in the communications division at Regional Command, was reviewing intercepted transmissions as part of routine security monitoring. His job was routine in the way that most intelligence work was routine. Hours of listening to nothing, filtered through software that flagged anomalies, fed through algorithms designed by people who'd never set foot in a combat zone. But Daniel Webb had learned to listen differently since his brother died. The transmission came through on a frequency that shouldn't have been active. A 2-minute window of encrypted chatter, degraded by distance and interference, but clear enough for someone who knew what to listen for. Daniel recognized certain keywords: weapons shipments, unauthorized transfers, contract overruns, and flagged the signal for higher analysis. Then he went to lunch and didn't think about it for several hours. When he came back, 3 people from the classified section were waiting at his desk. "Who else knows about this?" The oldest one, Major Patricia Gleason, asked without preamble. "Nobody," Daniel said. "Just flagged it for review." "It stays flagged," Gleason said. And it stays between you and us. Understand? Daniel understood. He'd watched enough institutional politics to recognize when something had moved beyond routine channels into something darker. 2 days later, Gleason called him into a secure room. With her were 3 other officers, 2 captains and a lieutenant, all with the kind of careful expressions that soldiers wore when they were about to ask someone to break rules. "Your brother," Gleason said quietly. "He was under Sarah Vance's command." It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "We need to tell you something," Gleason continued. "And then we need to ask you to do something that could cost you your career if you're wrong about who to trust." The story that emerged over the next hour transformed everything Daniel thought he knew about why his brother had died. The ambush at Outpost 4 hadn't been an accident. The infrastructure failure wasn't a failure. General Sterling had orchestrated the entire operation to eliminate Sarah Vance and any evidence she might have gathered about his illegal operations. "Vance got out," Gleason said. "She's been in the Crimson Woods for 6 months, disrupting supply lines, sabotaging patrols, leaving symbols. The military's calling it insurgent activity. Sterling's terrified." "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked. "Because we need someone to find her," Captain James Morrison said. He was younger than Gleason, maybe 35, with the kind of intensity that came from knowing too much about something you couldn't report through proper channels. "And because we need to connect her with someone who can actually expose what Sterling's done." That someone was Chloe Adams. Finding her took 3 days of careful work. Adams was an investigative journalist based in the regional capital. The kind of reporter who made military officials nervous by asking questions that didn't fit into official narratives. She'd been working on a story about inflated defense contracts for nearly 2 years, a slow burn that hadn't gone anywhere because all her sources dried up or recanted. Daniel approached her in a coffee shop, using language so carefully neutral that he sounded paranoid. Adams, to her credit, recognized a scared military officer when she saw one. She listened. She asked careful questions, and when Daniel provided her with the intercepted transmission and documented proof that it had been deliberately suppressed by higher command, she understood exactly what she was being handed. "I need to meet her," Adams said. "Vance, if this is real, if she actually has evidence." "She does," Morrison said. He was sitting at a nearby table, pretending to read a newspaper. "And she's willing. But it has to be on her terms. In the forest." The meeting was set for exactly 1 week later. Chloe Adams had written enough stories about military corruption to know that this assignment could get her killed, could get her arrested, could destroy her career if Sterling had enough influence over the press. She also understood that this was the story of her life, the kind of work that justified everything she'd sacrificed to become a journalist. She agreed without hesitation and spent 5 days preparing. She gathered every document she could find about Sterling's command history. She compiled financial records from open-source databases. She built a framework of questions designed to test whether Sarah Vance was actually Vance or some kind of elaborate setup. And then she drove into the forest with Morrison in an unmarked vehicle, carrying nothing but a backpack and a single encrypted hard drive. The abandoned compound was a relic from a military installation that had been decommissioned a decade earlier. Concrete structures slowly being reclaimed by the surrounding forest, accessible only by hiking trails that didn't appear on recent maps. Morrison left her there with supplies and a radio, then retreated to a position where he could monitor for approaching patrols without being visible. Chloe spent 2 hours sitting alone in the darkening forest before Sarah Vance emerged from the tree line. She looked nothing like the official photographs. Vance had been right then. Sharp lines, uniform presence, the bearing of someone accustomed to command. This version was harder, scarred, weathered in a way that suggested she'd spent months doing something beyond normal human endurance. Her eyes were different too, colder, more focused, the eyes of someone who'd made decisions that had cost lives. "You're really her," Chloe said. "I'm what's left of her," Vance replied. She sat down across from Chloe, keeping enough distance that neither of them felt immediately threatened. Morrison says you can do something with what I have. If it's real, Chloe said. If it's documented, if it can withstand scrutiny. Vance opened her tactical vest and began removing items. Documents first. Papers that had been waterproofed in canvas wrapping, protected through 6 months of forest survival. Ledgers with Sterling's handwriting. Financial transfers. Communications logs with timestamps and locations. Then came the photographs. Chloe's hands shook as she looked through them. Weapons shipments that didn't match official manifests. Contracts signed by Sterling and military contractors that showed prices inflated by 60, 70, sometimes 90%. Evidence of kickback schemes, of supply diversions, of equipment being sold to third parties on international black markets. How long have you had this? Chloe whispered. Since the operation that got my entire team killed, Vance said. I was there to gather intelligence on the facility. Outpost 4 wasn't a legitimate military installation. It was a logistics hub for Sterling's operation. He'd built it specifically to manage the illegal transfers. When he realized I'd found it, he decided it was cleaner to kill me than explain why I'd found it. Chloe looked up from the documents. And the sabotage? The Golden Eagle. Insurance, Vance said. I needed time. I needed Sterling to understand that I was still alive, still capable, still a threat. Every patrol disrupted, every supply line broken. It was creating pressure, creating moments where people would start asking questions, where people like Morrison would start looking for answers. Why not just go to the authorities? With what? Vance's expression didn't change, but something cold entered her voice. A dead officer with no official identity, living in a forest, with documents that Sterling could claim were forged. I had no credibility, no position, no institutional power. I needed someone like you first. Someone who could verify, who could investigate, who could make this story real to people who matter. Over the next 3 hours, Chloe documented everything. She photographed every ledger page, every communication, every piece of evidence with her encrypted camera. She asked questions and took notes and began seeing the architecture of Sterling's operation with increasing clarity. It wasn't just corruption. It was systematic, deliberate, and vast. He's enriched himself by at least $200 million, Chloe said finally. Maybe more. And that's just the contracts I can see. Multiply that, Vance said. I have 7 years of documentation, 7 years of building his operation while telling everyone it was legitimate military logistics. How did you survive out here? Chloe asked. Not for the story, but because she needed to understand how a person could do what Vance had done. Vance was quiet for a moment. My soldiers died because of his greed, she said. Marcus Webb was 23 years old. He had a younger brother. He had a life he never got to live. 12 soldiers in total. That's a lot of motivation to keep moving when everything in you wants to stop. The encrypted hard drive was filled before midnight. Everything Vance had was now copied, secured, protected. If something happened to her, if Sterling found her, if she disappeared into the forest, the evidence would survive. What happens now? Vance asked. I go back, Chloe said. I verify everything. I contact sources at the Department of Defense, the FBI, people who can't be compromised. I build a story that's airtight. It'll take time. How much time? 3 weeks, maybe 4. Vance nodded. I'll be here. As Morrison drove Chloe back to civilization, she understood what Vance was really doing. She wasn't just sabotaging Sterling's operations anymore. She was setting up the endgame, creating the conditions where Sterling would be forced to act. Forced to make mistakes, forced to overextend himself in ways that would expose him completely. The woman in the forest had turned herself into a trap, and Sterling, whether he knew it or not, was walking directly into it. General Arthur Sterling received the encrypted message at 0300 hours on a Tuesday morning. He was in his private quarters at the Regional Command compound, reviewing quarterly reports that documented another series of unexplained logistical failures. The message came through a secure channel that was supposed to be impossible to compromise. She's alive, Crimson Woods, waiting. Sterling didn't sleep for the next 36 hours. He'd known, on some level, that Sarah Vance might have survived the ambush. You didn't plan the systematic execution of a ranking officer without acknowledging the possibility of failure. But knowing in the abstract and having confirmation were different things. Confirmation meant she'd had 6 months to plan. Confirmation meant she'd had time to gather evidence, recruit allies, and position herself as a threat that couldn't be ignored. The golden eagle symbols throughout the forest took on new meaning. They weren't warnings. They were breadcrumbs. Vance had been leaving a trail that led directly back to him. Sterling made the decision to act personally on the second day of sleeplessness. He couldn't trust the regular chain of command anymore. Not when he didn't know who among his officers might be compromised, who might have already made contact with Vance, who might be waiting for the right moment to move against him. He needed someone he could trust absolutely. Someone whose loyalty he could count on. Colonel James Hayes had been a logical choice. Hayes was brilliant, efficient, and had trained directly under Vance years ago before being reassigned to Sterling's personal security apparatus. That last detail had seemed insignificant when Sterling had recruited him. Now it felt like a liability. But Sterling needed someone who understood Vance's tactical preferences, her patterns, her way of thinking. He needed someone who could hunt her. "I have a special assignment," Sterling had told Hayes in a private briefing. "Operational security requires compartmentalization. You need to know only what's essential." Sterling had explained the situation carefully. Intelligence suggested that a high-level terrorist was hiding in the Crimson Woods. The operation needed to be covert, off-book, with a specialized unit that reported only to Sterling. Hayes would command 100 soldiers, the best available, and they would locate and eliminate the target. "Who's the target?" Hayes had asked. Sterling had hesitated, and in that hesitation, something in Hayes's expression shifted. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, but Sterling caught it. "That's on a need-to-know basis," Sterling said. Hayes had nodded and left to begin preparations. 48 hours later, Colonel James Hayes was sitting across from Captain Morrison in a secure location, listening to everything Morrison knew about what had actually happened at Outpost 4. Morrison had taken a calculated risk reaching out to Hayes, betting that Vance's former student would recognize the truth when he heard it. He'd been right. "He sent me to kill her," Hayes said quietly. "He actually sent me to kill Commander Vance." "He's terrified," Morrison said, "because he knows what she has. He knows she's been documenting his operations. He's panicking." Hayes stood and walked to a window, looking out at the compound beyond. He'd served under Sterling for 4 years. He'd followed orders, done his job, advanced through the ranks. And all that time, Sterling had been using military resources to conduct illegal operations, to enrich himself, to create a system where officers like Vance who asked questions ended up dead. "I need to speak with her," Hayes said. The meeting happened in the forest, at a location that Morrison had arranged. Vance emerged with the same careful precision she used for everything. No wasted movement, no unnecessary risk. She regarded Hayes with the wariness of someone who understood that this could be a trap. "Colonel," she said. "Commander," Hayes replied. He kept his hands visible, kept his posture neutral. "I came to tell you that Sterling sent me to kill you." "I know," Vance said. "I've been monitoring Sterling's communications for weeks. I knew he'd eventually move against me directly. The question is, why are you here instead of leading that operation?" "Because Morrison told me the truth," Hayes said. "Because I realized that the only person worth following is you, not him." What happened next changed the entire tactical situation in ways that Sterling couldn't have anticipated. Hayes returned to his unit, the 100 soldiers Sterling had assembled for the operation, and told them what he knew. Some soldiers chose to leave the operation entirely. Most stayed, but they stayed for a different reason now. They stayed because they understood that Sterling had orchestrated the deaths of 12 soldiers to hide his crimes. They stayed because Commander Vance represented something better than what Sterling represented. When Sterling realized that Hayes had defected, he did exactly what Vance had anticipated he would do. He panicked. That panic led him to make his final mistake. Sterling mobilized 200 soldiers, nearly every combat-capable personnel from the regional command, and led the assault into the Crimson Woods himself. No subtlety, no careful planning. Just overwhelming force driven by desperation and the knowledge that his operation was collapsing. Vance had spent 6 months preparing for this exact moment. The assault began at dawn, with soldiers moving into the forest along the primary patrol routes. Sterling had decided on a sweep-and-clear operation, assuming that superior numbers would overwhelm Vance's defensive position. What he didn't understand was that Vance didn't have a defensive position. She had an entire forest that she'd transformed into a weapon. The first casualties came from devices that were so simple, so obvious in retrospect, that Sterling's tactical officers couldn't believe they'd worked. Tripwires attached to claymore mines positioned in the dense understory, designed to maim rather than kill, creating casualties that would require other soldiers to stop and render aid. Punji stakes in hidden pits. Explosives buried along the most likely routes of advance, triggered by pressure plates that were nearly impossible to detect. But the real trap came in the communications system. Vance had spent weeks learning the frequency bands that Sterling's operation used. She had equipment that had been salvaged from military installations, modified by the local engineers who'd been helping her, and positioned strategically throughout the forest. As Sterling's assault force advanced deeper into the woods, she began systematically jamming their communications. Not a total blackout that would be immediately obvious, but selective interference that made radio contact unreliable. Officers couldn't reach subordinates. Subordinates couldn't call for support. Sterling's 150-soldier command vehicle became isolated, separated from the main force by terrain and malfunction, and the simple chaos of an operation falling apart in real time. Sterling's command vehicle, a heavily armored Humvee with communication arrays and tactical displays, became his tomb. Vance had tracked its position throughout the assault. She'd anticipated that Sterling, as the operation deteriorated, would move deeper into the forest to gain direct oversight of the situation. She'd positioned her people, Morrison, Hayes, and a dozen soldiers loyal to Vance, along the most likely route that Sterling would take. When the Humvee appeared, moving slowly through the dense forest with its armed escort, Vance was waiting. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a massive explosion or a cinematic ambush. It was professional soldiers, well-positioned, with superior knowledge of the terrain, and a commander who understood exactly how Sterling would respond to pressure. The escort vehicles took heavy fire from 3 directions simultaneously. Within minutes, they were disabled. The soldiers inside had nowhere to go and no expectation of reinforcement. They surrendered. Sterling himself didn't try to run. He sat in the command vehicle, staring at the tactical display showing the complete breakdown of his assault force, watching soldiers retreat or surrender in real time. By the time Vance's people opened the Humvee doors, Sterling had already understood that his operation, his entire life's work, had been dismantled in less than 6 hours. Vance looked at him through the open door of the vehicle. Sterling looked back, and for a moment, they were simply 2 commanders assessing each other across the wreckage of choices made and consequences endured. "You tried to kill me," Vance said. "You tried to destroy me," Sterling replied. "No," Vance said. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure someone was paying attention." Sterling was secured and moved to a detention facility operated by loyalist soldiers under Hayes's command. The assault force, scattered and demoralized, retreated from the forest. Of the 200 soldiers Sterling had sent in, 3 were dead, 17 were seriously wounded, and the rest were processing what it meant to have followed a commander into a situation that had been impossible from the beginning. By nightfall, the Crimson Woods was quiet again. Morrison coordinated the transfer of Sterling to federal custody. Chloe Adams, working through contacts she'd cultivated over years of investigative work, had the story ready to publish. A comprehensive account of Sterling's illegal operations, his systematic enrichment through military corruption, and his orchestration of the Outpost 4 ambush. The evidence Vance had gathered, combined with the financial records Morrison's team had compiled, was devastating. Sterling's defense collapsed within 72 hours of the published story. Senior military officials who'd benefited from his network moved to distance themselves from him. Contractors who'd participated in his schemes began negotiating plea agreements. The military tribunal convened quickly. The verdict was inevitable: life imprisonment, loss of all rank and benefits, a sentence that would end in a federal prison rather than retirement with honors. Vance watched the proceedings from a safe location, alongside Hayes and Morrison and Chloe Adams. She didn't feel satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction required the belief that justice meant something permanent, that it could undo the deaths of 12 soldiers or restore what had been lost. But it was closure of a sort. And for a soldier who'd spent 6 months alone in the forest, closure was enough. Chloe Adams' story published on a Friday morning, leading every major news outlet by afternoon. The headline was simple and devastating: General Sterling's war profiteering scandal, how one commander's corruption led to the deaths of 12 soldiers. The article ran to 40,000 words across multiple installments, meticulously documented, exhaustively sourced. It detailed the Outpost 4 facility, the ambush, the cover-up. It showed the financial trails, the inflated contracts, the systematic diversion of military resources into Sterling's personal enrichment. It explained how a ranking general had turned the military logistics system into a personal profit machine. Most importantly, it introduced the world to Commander Sarah Vance. The official narrative of her death at Outpost 4 became untenable within 48 hours of publication. Investigators began asking questions that led to inconsistencies in Sterling's reports, to communications that had been scrubbed from official records, to witnesses who suddenly remembered details they'd previously been discouraged from mentioning. The military moved fast when institutional reputation was at stake. By day 3, Sterling had been formally charged with treason, murder, conspiracy, fraud, and 24 related crimes. By day 5, he was being held in a secure federal facility pending court-martial. By day 10, senior officers were testifying before Congress about how Sterling's operation had compromised military integrity at the highest levels. Sterling's defense was minimal and futile. His lawyers argued that the evidence had been gathered by unauthorized means, that Vance's actions constituted illegal surveillance, that the documents had been compromised. But the ledgers had Sterling's handwriting. The communications had his voice. The transfer records matched his movements. There was no defense, only the slow, grinding machinery of institutional accountability processing the magnitude of what he'd done. The military tribunal took 3 weeks. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. The sentence was mandatory: life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Sterling would die in federal prison, his name permanently associated with one of the largest corruption scandals in military history. When the verdict was read, Colonel James Hayes sat in the gallery and allowed himself a single moment of satisfaction. Then he returned to work, focusing on the task of rebuilding the command structure that Sterling's corruption had compromised. But Sarah Vance wasn't in the courtroom for the verdict. She was in the Crimson Woods, preparing to leave. The forest had been her refuge for 7 months. It had hidden her, sustained her, transformed her into something harder and more purposeful than she'd been before. But now that the mission was complete, now that Sterling was facing a life sentence, now that the evidence was public and the institutions were moving against him, the forest had become something else. A cage, a place that held memories of soldiers who would never leave it. She packed carefully. The shelter she'd built was dismantled and returned to forest. Fallen timber scattered, camouflage removed, nothing left but a space that would be reclaimed by growth within weeks. The supply caches were distributed among the locals who'd helped her, who'd understood without being told that they were part of something larger than themselves. Morrison found her at the edge of the forest, at a place where the dense woods opened onto a ridge that overlooked a valley stretching toward civilization. "You're leaving," Morrison said. "I'm leaving," Vance confirmed. "Where will you go?" Vance was quiet for a long moment. She'd spent so long focused on the mission, on survival, on building the case against Sterling, on creating the trap that would catch him, that she hadn't thought much about what came after. Now, standing at the boundary between the wild and the inhabited world, she had to confront the question of what a woman like her did when the war was finally over. "I don't know," she said. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can live without wondering if every sound in the night is someone coming to finish what Sterling started." "You could come back to the military," Morrison suggested. "Help rebuild. You have credibility now. You have—" "I have ghosts," Vance interrupted quietly. 12 of them. Every time I put on a uniform, every time I walk into a military facility, I see their faces. Marcus Webb was 23. He was supposed to graduate from college. Instead, he bled out in a forest because Sterling decided his conscience was inconvenient. Morrison didn't respond. He understood. Most soldiers understood, even if they didn't talk about it openly. "The legend stays, though," Vance said. "The Golden Eagle. That stays in the forest. That becomes the story people tell when they're thinking about corruption, about what happens when institutions fail soldiers. The symbol survives even if the person behind it doesn't." "What about Hayes? What about your soldiers?" "Hayes gets to rebuild something better," Vance said. "My soldiers, the ones who survived, they're already moving on. That's what soldiers do. We survive, we adapt, we move forward." Vance descended the ridge as the sun was falling, moving down toward the valley where Morrison had arranged for a vehicle to be waiting. She didn't look back at the forest. Looking back would have meant acknowledging all the time spent there, all the loss that the trees had witnessed, all the ways she'd been changed by months of isolation and purpose. The car that picked her up was unmarked and driven by someone Morrison knew, anonymous in the way that security operations required. Vance sat in the back seat, watching the landscape transform from forest to farmland to the outskirts of a small city. She was nobody to these people, just another person passing through, heading to some destination that wasn't their business. She'd made arrangements beforehand. A small house outside a mid-sized town, 3 states away from any military installation. A name that wasn't hers, Margaret Oakes, and identification that would hold up to casual scrutiny. Money from sources that Sterling's corruption had exposed, funds that were being returned to legitimate purposes. A life that didn't require her to explain who she'd been or why she'd disappeared. The house was small and anonymous, and exactly what she needed. Vance spent the first week simply sleeping. 7 months of adrenaline and vigilance had extracted a price that rest could begin to pay down. She slept 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours at a time, waking briefly to eat, and then returning to the darkness of deep unconsciousness. By the second week, she was reading. The news about Sterling's conviction, the lengthy profile that Chloe Adams had written about her, carefully avoiding Vance's current location but documenting her heroism, her sacrifice, her determination to expose corruption at any cost. She read about the reforms that were beginning in the military logistics system, the investigations into other commanders who might have been following Sterling's playbook, the congressional hearings about oversight failures, the evidence she'd gathered, the risk she'd taken, the months of isolation. It all meant something. That was the small comfort she held on to. By the 3rd week, she'd established a routine. Morning walks through the neighborhood, nothing that drew attention. An afternoon job at a small bookstore in town where they didn't ask questions about her background. Evenings spent in the house with tea and books and the weight of understanding what she'd survived. She didn't expect healing. Healing was for people who hadn't seen what she'd seen, who hadn't lost what she'd lost. But she could accept the presence of scars. She could live with the memory of 12 soldiers whose sacrifice had exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of military command. In the Crimson Woods, the legend continued to grow. Soldiers whispered about the Golden Eagle in barracks and mess halls, telling the story of a commander who'd been abandoned by her superiors and had spent months alone, sabotaging Sterling's operations, leaving symbols that became a warning to anyone who would trade soldiers' lives for personal gain. The carved eagles on trees throughout the forest became pilgrimages for junior officers, physical reminders that corruption had consequences. Sterling's corruption didn't die with his conviction. Other officers were implicated, other operations were exposed, other systems of enrichment were dismantled. The dominoes fell in slow motion, each one revealing another layer of institutional compromise. And underneath it all, like the foundation of something that would endure, was the story of Sarah Vance, a woman who'd refused to die, who'd refused to be silenced, who'd transformed her survival into a weapon against the people who'd tried to erase her. 2 years after leaving the Crimson Woods, Sarah received a letter. The envelope was unmarked and contained a single photograph, the golden eagle carving on the massive pine tree where she'd left it months ago. In the photograph, someone had begun adding to it, newer carvings that built on her design, extending it across the bark of adjacent trees. A collective work now, no longer something created by a single person but by many hands, many people who understood the symbol's meaning. On the back of the photograph, a handwritten note in Morrison's careful script. The forest remembers. The soldiers remember. And the corruption never comes back. Sarah kept the photograph on her nightstand. Some nights, when sleep was difficult and the memories pressed too close, she would look at it and remember why she'd survived. Not for herself, for the 12 soldiers who hadn't, for the institutions that needed to be reminded that they served a purpose larger than enriching the people at the top. The legend of the Golden Eagle endured because it represented something true, that even when the system failed, when institutions were compromised and corruption reached into the highest levels, there could still be individuals willing to stand against it, willing to sacrifice everything, willing to survive in the darkness until the light finally came. Sarah Vance never wore a uniform again, never returned to the military, never sought recognition or acknowledgement for what she'd done. She was Margaret Oakes to everyone around her, the quiet woman who worked at the bookstore, who took long walks in the evening, who lived a small life in a small town that asked nothing of her except that she exist peacefully within it. But in the forest she'd left behind, in the stories soldiers told in barracks and mess halls, in the institutional memory of a system that had been forced to confront its own corruption, she endured as something more, as a symbol, as a warning, as proof that survival itself could be an act of resistance. The Golden Eagle watched over the Crimson Woods, carved into trees by hands that Sarah would never meet, remembered by soldiers she would never know. And that was enough.